Okay, there's going to be two parts tonight. I'll just kind of spend 15 minutes giving you a kind of a high-level overview of these environmental markets, what they are and how they're emerging. In our next session, we'll go through in a bit more detail with respect to those, and then Morty in the second half will talk through in a little bit more detail and make them a bit more relevant with respect to what farmers can do and how the Regen Farmers Mutual actually helps, if you like. So, without further ado, so where this starts from is that we're at a point, inflection point in the sense that environmental markets, we know that there's a coming tide of demand for environmental markets, both with respect to carbon markets. So the carbon market last year was 226 million. It was the total size of the market. Someone like the Climate Market Institute suggesting that the market's going to be anywhere from 10 to 24 billion by 2030, which is not all that far away. And not only are carbon markets seen to be growing based on increasing demand from corporates in particular, but also the types of things that environmental markets encompass are growing. So there's biodiversity, as we're all hearing with respect to COP26 in Glasgow. But biodiversity is becoming a thing. We recognise that we're in the midst of a really a crisis with respect to biodiversity globally. And similarly, there's other types of environmental markets that can be developed or are developing. So we already understand, water is one as an environmental market, but we've got transactions that look like that we're working on with respect to flood resilience, for example. Whole of farm type measures are things that we can see that markets will kind of emerge around. And one of the catalysts for the mutual and what we're doing is that we recognise that most farmers are really too small to access the environmental markets as they are. They're complex and difficult and require scale in terms of to be able to cover the transaction costs. So just to give you a sense of about how these markets are evolving. So this is on the right-hand side, you can see the carbon price in Europe. And it's been in the news lately because gas prices have gone parabolic over there, and that's part of the reflection of the policies that have been enacted with respect to carbon. And so what we're really trying to point out here is that carbon markets are they're a government-led market, and in Europe they're a government-led market through what's called a compliance market. So there they are very strong about enforcing emitters to offset their carbon. And so what you can see here is various points in time where European legislators have introduced new legislation which effectively kept on ratcheting up the demand for carbon. And so that's what's led to higher carbon prices. In Australia, however, we don't have a compliance market. We have effectively the one very large buyer is the way it kind of works. So the Commonwealth Government set up the Emissions Reduction Fund, and the Emission Reduction Fund buys around about 96% of all carbon credits issued in Australia last year, or bought in Australia last year. And so it's very much in a government-dominated market in Australia as opposed to a compliance market. There isn't any. There's a safeguard mechanism where very, very large emitters need to offset some emissions, but in general, we don't have a mechanism to enforce corporates to buy carbon. But we are seeing the first signs of corporate institutions looking to voluntarily buy carbon in Australia, and certainly in the US and in Europe. Across the course of this year, the volumes have absolutely ballooned in those markets, and we're starting to see the start of that in Australia as well, which is being reflected in the carbon price to some degree. As you can see, it's stepping up higher. So the nature of this market is it really results in a one-sided market. It's funny to call it a market in one way when you have one big buyer kind of dictating what they're going to pay. And you can see on the right in this chart, these are the volumes of ACCUs, that's the carbon credit equivalent in Australia. And they're the volume of ACCUs that have been transacted in various years. And you can just see the start of this green bar is the voluntary cancellations. That's the voluntary market buyers emerging. And as we say, it's been driven by ESG and the growth of net zero in corporates. And so the way that the volunteer market is been working, because we don't have that same compliance market mechanisms kind of underwriting demands, the way, sorry, apologies, that's my dishwasher. The way it's been working is that we're very price sensitive in Australia. And so what that means is that corporates are looking for the lowest possible price that they pay for carbon. And so because carbon just comes straight off the bottom line, it comes out of their profit margins, they look for the lowest cost. And the way they do that is they've been tending to buy lots of cheap carbon from Southeast Asia. So we've got an example here on the right where you can offset your carbon when you buy a particular product through Boomi. And when you do that, they automatically offset your carbon. And so here you can see there's the absolute majority of this carbon has been brought through, from a solar project in India, and it would have been for $1 or $2 or $3 US a tonne. Whereas in Australia, there was a tiny little bit amount bought for a koala preservation, but it was at a higher price. And so what that enables is they can kind of package up and say, well, we're doing good things in India and we're also doing really good things in Australia. So it provides the local narrative. And that's the way the market's currently kind of sitting. And you can see this is the kind of the total market value volume in 2021 financial year. And you can see these kind of the numbers borne out. That this is the ERF, so that's that federal government fund, the emissions reduction fund, and they bought $180 million worth of the 226 that was transacted. And you can see down here on the bottom two lines the voluntary demand and the difference between the volume of ACCUs, so that's the our Australian carbon credits, and there was only roughly 900,000 bought of those, and 8.6 million bought of these carbon emission receipts, which are international, the internationally recognised receipts. And you can see that, having said that, the price paid was, or the total value paid was roughly the same because the price was lower for the emissions. And so this kind of reflects a market which is a function of having one very large buyer, and therefore having a small voluntary market, and also reflects the fact that by virtue of this, the market structure has been created where it's very broker dominated. These brokers, middlemen, come in and intermediate and do so in a way that can kind of tap into that demand. And so the outcome of this is that the structure creates very high transaction costs, it inhibits growth, and there's a need for standardisation and competition, which is where the mutual comes in to some degree. And so what's happening is that the markets are moving to beyond carbon, as we said before. So governments in particular have started this approach, so that the Commonwealth Government has just, as you might have seen, run a biodiversity stewardship pilot, and they've now got the enhanced remnant vegetation pilot underway. And they're both aimed at leveraging the ERF mechanism, but for biodiversity purposes. Similarly, the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland has that concept of basing the carbon off ACCUs, but then paying for either carbon co-benefits or even cultural co-benefits in the case of Indigenous credits. And similarly, there's other programs in WA that's been announced, and Bushbank in Victoria and PIPAP in New South Wales are on their way, and we know that they have embedded biodiversity in it. So one of the points to note here is that governments are really good at handing out money to some degree. Well, they are good at handing out money. The way they do it might be the best at times, but they're not necessarily great at catalysing markets. And so there is a demand for change, particularly given that there is a rising tide of voluntary demand from corporates who are kind of responding to their net zero requirements, to this consumer demand that corporates change their behaviour. And so that rising demand can be seen in initiatives like the Marketplace for Nature. The Marketplace for Nature is a project that started last year, which was looking at how to expand markets beyond carbon. But it's got the likes of the Nature Conservancy, ILSC, the 10 Deserts Project, and the Farmers Mutual is a member of this and so what we've been doing is looking at what the demand is from corporates. So we went through a process at the start of last year where we interviewed 50 odd corporates and government departments to understand what their demands were, what they were seeing with respect to carbon and environmental markets more broadly. And we could see that there was a couple of key trends coming through there. One was this idea that folk were looking for more than carbon. They were looking for carbon plus co-benefits, whether that was co-benefits for a narrative purpose or because that they genuinely were looking for offsets for water or biodiversity. And the other thing was that there is increasing demand for transparency and standardisation, that corporate buyers, are also looking to drive down transaction costs. So what we have currently is a market structure that's not aligned with farmers. So the nature of having one large buyer, as I said before, has enabled brokers to come in and kind of step in where they typically charge anywhere from 30 to 50 to even up to 80% in the case of some brokered kind of structures. And so they end up taking 50% of the gross revenue that's being created by these transactions. Now that's clearly an inefficient market, because that's they're very fat margins. And so the way this works is that in this type of market, in order to I'm a broker once upon a time I used to be a broker, so I understand, in order to keep both sides of a transaction happy, the way a broker approaches this is by trying to make it as complex as possible and as opaque as possible, because then no one knows what you're actually pricing, and you can maximise your margins. So brokers in the current market are motivated to swim against the tide, if you like, of transparency and reducing transaction costs. And that also means that it inhibits their ability to do to do small transactions, because they need it to be a certain size in order to be able to cover the costs of undertaking a transaction. So the market structure is not aligned to farmers currently, which is where the Regen Farmers Mutual came from. So we started out in May last year with a series of workshops that were funded through the Cooperative Farming Program that Jackie and Amy were part of. And those enabled us to step through first understanding the problem. What is the problem, and what are the dimensions of it, and what are some potential solutions. And then we stepped into a farmer-only section where we kind of defined, well, if it were to go ahead, what would be the way it would work? What would be the principles? What would farmers need to agree between themselves to understand how this could work? And then we moved to a next series where the farmers involved in that said, yep, this is looking really good. Let's look at how we could actually scale this, how we could really create this vehicle. And so out of this all came the creation of the steering committee in May 21, and then the formation of the mutual in July 21, which was a auspicious day. And so this is where we are. We have the Regen Farmers Mutual. And so the key thing to remember with the mutual is the objective is that farmers retain more of the value. And so under a transaction with the mutual, the idea is that farmer would get to keep 80% of the revenue from a transaction, but the 10% of that revenue would then go to the farm group that provides on-ground support with respect to a transaction. So that's whether it's the person who's coming on ground onto the farm to help kind of the farmer record data, or whether it's that farm group that's providing education support with respect to these transactions. And then 10% of the revenue goes to the mutual to cover its operating overheads. Now, clearly, because it's owned by farmers, it doesn't have a profit maximisation imperative. It's actually, the objective of farmers is to find that level of profits that allows the mutual to kind of operate most efficiently, if you like. And so that's where we've landed, the Farmers Mutual. I think I'm going to now pass over to Wardy.
Rowan, thank you so much. Would you mind being my slide person and move me one forward? So I'm going to talk about markets from the other end, where Rowan has approached it from understanding the macroeconomics. I want to talk from the ground up. And what that means is talking about what is a regenerative farmer. We're the Regenerative Farmers Mutual, So, regenerative in agriculture can have some contentiousness about it, but we've got a very simple definition. A regenerative farmer is one that is economically and environmentally profitable. And if you're economically, profitable, but ecologically unprofitable, you're actually a miner. What you're doing is you're mining your ecological wealth. And we know from experience that you can bankrupt soils and you can make land that was previously very productive, unproductive. And I come from Western New South Wales originally, and I've seen plenty of that. And I'd also say that it's not just about making an ecological profit and not a financial return, because that's conservation. What we actually want is regenerative agriculture. So you will know an ecological profit, you know an economic one. It's a P&L, it's balance sheet, it's generally accepted terms of profit and loss. But ecological accounting works like if you've got more covered ground and less bare ground year after year, you're making an ecological profit. If you've got more soil fertility and organic matter compared to the year before and you're growing that, you're making an ecological profit. If your biodiversity is increasing, you're making an ecological profit. And so it's not, it's not woo-woo being regenerative. It's simply managing both profits so that you sit in that sweet spot. So what should you do? Well, the answer to that is it's entirely up to your context. But what we're trying to do as Regen Farmers Mutual is help you understand your options, make a plan that suits your context, and then make money from those markets. So let's explore how that can happen. Rowan, next slide, please. Your farm is, your kingdom, and you can do stuff on your farm very simply. There are green finance options that will allow you to improve an asset like a dam by planting biodiverse and habitat regions around it. This has multiple benefits on your farm, apart from, the increased habitat for wildlife. It can improve the water holding capacity of the dam, help you through droughts, and mentally it's good to have a bit of water sitting around. But if we're to genuinely address the twin evils of climate change and biodiversity loss to the point where we could have an extinction level event, we actually need not just to be doing things on our individual farm, but we need to be coordinating. And it's not to say that doing things on your individual farm can't be profitable. I'll talk to you about Claire Cannon. Run the next slide, please. Claire was, I guess, the inspiration for Regen Farmers Mutual. So she's a farmer down in Holbrook. The main highway in Australia running from Sydney to Melbourne goes straight past, and they were doing an extension. So they were looking to offset some grey box that they had taken over with the road. And so Claire had on her property 600 hectares, or about a third of her property was grey box. She understood that there was an opportunity to still graze. It wasn't permanently taken out of production. In fact, grazing and crash grazing to prevent fire risk was encouraged. It was part of the management plan. And so she actually got most of the productivity benefit of that 600 hectares, but also the conservation benefit. Additionally, she was able to bring together scientists to help her create a carbon project for which she received, north of $250,000. And as importantly as that financial, payment by the environmental markets was the increase that she could attract from her food and fibre sales. So her beef went into the Cape Grim direct restaurant supply chain, and her wool went into the QZ supply chain. And her provenance, her green credentials were what enabled her to move into those premium markets. And so Next slide, please, Rowan. So what you can do individually, it can be maximized at a regional and local level. And I want to talk to you about Loddon Plains. Loddon Plains down in central Victoria has two bird populations that don't get to make baby chicks in spring because there's not a continuous habitat. There's also an opportunity in Loddon Plains to get farmers creating habitat, a corridor, actually, an east-west corridor that would connect those two bird populations, and to coordinate the plantings of that corridor such that they get paid for the carbon whilst providing that biodiversity benefit at a landscape scale. And additionally, the local NRM plan, the Natural Resource Management Plan, refers to one goal being to strengthen that particular bird populations, which they were worried because of a lack of habitat might actually crash out. So individually, there's about 90 farmers in that area who are all regen farmers that belong to regen groups. And so that what they're able to do is interrogate a data set that the government have created called the full cam data set. If you go to the next page, Rowan, I'll just use the key. So that previous map showed blues and greens and patches of red. And this table in front of us shows how the full cam data set works. So for growers, it's relatively, or for farmers, it's relatively easy. You want to plant any carbon plantations in red, orange, yellow rather than blue. So that will give you, a 10 times volume per hectare or payment as a result of planting in red compared to blue. So to get that payment, it's relatively easy. The full cam data set can be interrogated. You can buy plants. They can be, the same species or multi-species, ideally environmentally multi-species. But then they will need to get to 2 meters height and a 20% crown. And once they've achieved that, you can enter into a 25-year or 100-year agreement. And then you simply multiply the number of accus by the current price to get the revenue per farmer. But when they've got that corridor together, not only are those farmers getting individual carbon payments, they're getting the opportunity to create a biodiverse habitat that, is good for their kids, it's good for their environment, but potentially is additionally rewarded from biodiversity markets. So I want to move to the next, if that's all right, Rowan. Soil carbon is something that you will have heard of. Now, soil carbon is interesting. It's, another of the methods that can be taken through the regulated market. If it is, then you need to show additionality. So what is the practice that you've changed in your farming operation that has meant that you've sequestered more carbon than you otherwise would have? So for most people, soil carbon can be most easily acquired through moving from set stocking to time-controlled grazing, which is largely a function of going from a fewer larger paddocks to many smaller paddocks, which you use electric fencing for. Now, the other thing that's really interesting about soil carbon, if you go to the next slide, is that it's got a huge amount of interest from the voluntary market. So unlike just the ERF, which deals with the full cam standing market, there's an interest which is sort of proven in Australia now, thanks to the Wilmot and Cavan Station deals that were done, where some soil carbon, created through time-controlled grazing, measured, it went and would have complied with an ERF product, but was actually sold through a Regen Digital, a blockchain marketplace, to Microsoft in the US. Now, what do I like about this story and why I think it's so pioneering is not because of the practice change, but because of the way that Microsoft have approached this. Microsoft, well, no company, in fact, had a net carbon zero goal, let alone by 2030 or 2050, just a few years ago. Now there's 2,800 of these very large organizations like Microsoft and BHP that have got net zero policies. And so what Microsoft did was it shared its process of going through and auditing and measuring and doing the due diligence and how they chose to reward that soil carbon and pay for it with other buyers, so that other buyers don't have that same friction in the pipeline. Next slide, please. The other thing that's interesting is that carbon is getting this additionality where you change practice to show that you've done something in carbon, but there's also this carbon plus concept. So for the LRF, which most of you will be familiar with, you can attach to carbon co-benefits around social co-benefits, which or cultural co-benefits. Biodiversity is a co-benefit, and we think animal welfare and maybe nutrient runoff and other water quality things, particularly in relation to the reef, might also become co-benefits that, when attached to the ERF and the ACCU creation process, have the scientific rigor that people are looking for, but additionally describe other benefits beyond the carbon gas and the CO2 equivalent. What's really interesting about Carbon Plus is the price that has, it's moved from, say, $3 an ACCU additional payment to $30 per ACCU additional payment. That's a 10 times increase in the last 12 months just on the biodiversity side of things. It's really heating up. Next slide, please, Rowan. So, you know, one of the pioneers of this Carbon Plus market is actually your Food and Agribusiness Network. So we will support what's going on between Accounting for Nature to measure the biodiversity and to help you go through the ERF program to get your ACCUs plus biodiversity benefits. And we'll continue to work with you to work out what additional markets will emerge for those farmers. It's not a one shot and you're done. So the next slide, please, Ron. So in summary, what we can do as a mutual is help farmers, you know, engage locally by, you know, incentivizing farm groups to form and share ideas about common landscape goals, challenges individually with changes in practice or what are environmental assets, etc. We can help them define to the point where they can take a term sheet to the regulated and the voluntary carbon markets, the biodiversity markets, the conservation markets, and see what the best value packaging and stacking of environmental assets is. Then, you know, traditionally with food and fiber sales, you grow a crop, you sell a crop, you get paid for a crop, but it's on a sort of annual basis. These environmental market transactions are long dated, maybe 25 years, but they're contingent on annual data that is proofed that shows that the buyers who aren't living on your property actually can see that there is improved biodiversity or increased carbon levels or whatever it is that has been sold to them. And that requires, you know, a mutual to be there over the long haul to help those farmers in that farm group to co-regulate and to reduce costs on that ongoing administration and compliance side of things. Next slide, please, Ryan. So the sorts of, you know, contexts that these can be put into are really interesting. Obviously, we can talk more about the specific fan context. I'd just like to say, though, across Australia, we're seeing, you know, growing interest from farm groups, whether they're wine grape growers in the Riverland looking at water, that east-west biodiversity corridor, or, you know, flood mitigation opportunities. Next one, please, Ryan. But the first step to get get on the path to being a regenerative farmer, where you can make an economic and an environmental profit annually, is to actually understand what environmental assets you have on your farm, and then what opportunities in the environmental markets would best suit your context. And the way we do that is with an environmental farm assessment. So an environmental farm assessment allows you to gather information on your property through a questionnaire, through a mapping exercise, and through in-field sample collections. And we bring all of that back, and we call that data pool and map a digital twin. It's a twin of your real world asset, the farm. And we allow, or you allow as a farmer, various providers from the regulated and voluntary carbon and biodiversity and conservation markets to give you or run their algorithms over your data, and then provide back to you indicative opportunities according to their worldview. So it might be that your lender looks at your digital twin and says, well, indicatively, we could index your interest rate. Or it might be that a standing carbon assessor looks at your property, runs the full CAM algorithm and goes, you've got a great opportunity for standing carbon, or a soil carbon offset report is provided to you. And all of these opportunities then emerge. But the first step is to understand what are the environmental assets that you have, and take it a step at a time. Next slide, please, Rowan. So the benefits of a digital twin, aside from being the first step, is that once you've got that data, you can forecast and model different scenarios based on climate, based on agronomic decisions. You can enter into the SMART agreements that the Regen Farmers Mutual Nature Fund requires each farmers to enter into. It's those stewardship agreements which underpin the ability for the mutual to then sell your carbon or biodiversity with others to the market at the scale they want to buy. And of course, once you've got that data that's showing your greenness, it provides the story of the provenance that will enable you to access markets without penalty, like Europe with their carbon adjustment border tax, or to get a premium like we saw Claire Cannon get through her beef and her wool sales. So your next steps will be to understand your options, make a plan, and make money from environmental markets. And your digital twin of your farm is the best way to do that. And you create your digital twin through an environmental farm assessment. Next step, please, Ryan. To get your environmental farm assessment, which we can roll out in the first quarter of next year, you have to join the wait list. We would love, as an outcome of today, that anybody who is interested in learning more about the Regen Farmers Mutual, go onto the wait list. And that will also put you onto our newsletter and enable us to keep you updated about the product and the business. Thank you, and let's go to some questions. Is anyone still awake?
Okay, so we did have a comment from Pam. Where's your comment gone, Pam?
It's just in the chat, Jackie. It says, one of the most common questions encountered here is what quantum of land might be required and what sort of landscape for carbon project to be available or to be viable in Andrew's experience.
So there are some minimum requirements for certain markets. So I think conservation agreements tend to be 20 hectares or larger. Standing carbon agreements through the ERF tend to be 40 hectares or larger. What we enable farmers to do is enter into individual stewardship agreements. So a particular land manager with Regen Farmers Mutual Nature Fund creates a stewardship agreement. We can then aggregate those stewardship agreements and then put them into voluntary or regulated markets. And so that enables farmers to collectivize in order to reach the thresholds. Now, we obviously want to see food and fibre sustainably produced in Australia, but if you're a lifestyle blocky person, you might not have the time to produce food and fibre, but you recognise you've got riparian zone or carbon opportunities. You can still enter in as long as you're an active land manager into the Regen Farmers Mutual. You don't have to be so big that you're producing food and fibre as your primary income for tax purposes or anything like that. Hopefully that answers the question, Pamela.
Nina Sexton has asked, how do the groups work to increase the land mass for consideration? Maybe Wardy just answered that. Do you think, Nina? Or would you like to rephrase the question yourself?
Yeah, when we were first looking at some of the information that was sent out, it was an opportunity to form particular groups. To if you for yourself had a small area or a small farm, if you came together in a group, you had a better land mass opportunity for different markets. What I'm thinking about is I have quite a few neighbours on a valley system on the Upper Timbarron Creek Road who would all be interested in this but have small farms individually, but the outcomes would be quite significant if we looked all together along the creek going into the 6 mile catchment as well.
Scale is and bringing on farmers into make a landscape scale change. It is one of the kind of philosophies, I guess, that the principles that the farmers who co-designed this came up with. What we came up with was the concept of an open product. So when you join a health mutual or a superannuation fund, you as an individual can enter into dental or optical or fitness and ambulance, different products that are offered by the mutual. So we want open products in terms of environmental markets. So within a region, within a group, there'll be an economically scalable point at which you can open a transaction for the first time. But once it's open, you actually want to encourage, and let's say that that scale is 15% of your valley might be required. You still want 16 to 95% of that valley to join the transaction over time and coordinate their environmental activities. So you want to keep that transaction open. You don't want to, however, bear all the costs of development of that transaction. So there's some indexation to reward the early people in and to reward those who've got a higher ecological condition because of possibly past practices that they haven't been rewarded for. And there's also incentives to grow the transaction. So it's not just the first farmers in, but we all benefit through landscape scale impacts and economies of scale that come with that. Any other questions?
What I have a curveball that I haven't
Is it breaking up for anybody other than me? Oh,
yeah,
we're just losing
it is. Maybe turn your video off, Jackie. We just can't quite hear you.
I think the curveball went through to the pitcher. Maybe Karen, who's got her hand up.
I was wondering what happened.
It sounds very robotic, doesn't it? Let me try and message Jackie, and we might maybe
Land changes hands. Does the
there is a question. There is a question in the group that Nina asked. How do the groups work to increase the land mass for consideration?
I think I just answered that to Nina before.
Perfect.
Yep, sorry, Leah. Yeah, we went through that just before Jackie's question. So that was all good.
Sweet.
Karen Jarling's got her hand up. Maybe we could ask Karen if you can ask your question.
Hey everybody, I was just waiting for the traffic to clear there a little bit in case it all came good again. Having looked very briefly at a few of the different offerings, not solely relating to carbon farming, but to some of the different grant options that are available over the last few years, where does something like this stand in comparison to some of those where they're quite rigid in the requirements? It has to be an uncommenced project. It has to be native plants only. Some of them require, interestingly, fencing to keep the native animals out. What about those sort of hoops to be jumped through? Are there things like that we need to be aware of?
So the actual process, the context and the practices that each farmer engage with will be defined in their stewardship agreement, which really talks to the objective. What are they trying to do? The practices and the measurements, and therefore the outcomes. What are they measuring? They're measuring an outcome on their land and an outcome for the buyer. And so it's very difficult to give you a precise set of requirements for any particular environmental transaction. So what we do know is various markets will have various conditions. So the LRF and the ERF require the attachment of contracts to title. But other contracts that we're seeing might be 10, 15-year agreements with +10 extensions. We've seen lease type agreements around Southeast Queensland. So to actually prescriptively say, well, in your, without enough knowledge of your particular scenario, what would be the requirement or not, I can't be sure, but you know.
No, that's okay. I just wasn't sure whether, I understand every situation will vary, but it was more a case of not on the landholder's side, more so on the, I don't know whether you would say the carbon buyer's side, whether they have boxes to tick sort of thing, as in, you know, you have to have this, this and this before we will consider you sort of thing, which seems to be how many of the other larger trading schemes are working.
Yeah, and so that's exactly what it comes down to, Karen. It's like, so who's the buyer and what are they prepared to pay for, basically?
Right.
One of the things that we think that the mutual does differently, it enables the aggregation of farmers so that we have an institutional entity that can negotiate transactions with a stronger hand, if you like, with more institutional power. So there's kind of two things that happen there. Is one is that with that negotiation power, we hope to be able to kind of negotiate terms that work for farmers, you know, in a particular circumstance. So that's seeking to kind of say that transactions shouldn't be, you know, these are conversations we're having with New South Wales government, for example, saying that rather than adopt we're going to do a grant, and the grant is going to have these preconditions, and if you don't meet those conditions, you don't get the grant. We'd like to turn it around the other way. So we're having that conversation with New South Wales Transport, for example, saying if you enter into like early negotiations with us, you can strategically achieve your objectives with respect to biodiversity offsets, for example, and you can engage communities, so to achieve a social license with respect to what you're trying to achieve, on the proviso that you're actually negotiating with us in terms of what you know, delivering your outcomes. So that's kind of trying to give you an example of it. We're trying to change the process a little bit from being reactive to to a government grant to having this proactive kind of negotiation kind of process.
Yep, thank you.
I think we have Jackie back if she wants to ask a question. You just on mute, Jackie.
What happens when land changes hands? Does the agreement or does the membership of the mutual change hands with the land, or does it stay with the farmer and end with the farmer?
I imagine it would be stewardship agreements would pass with the sale of the business. They're attached to that land through the digital twin, and succession issues will come into play for families and for change of ownership. We haven't launched yet, Jackie, so we haven't had to actually go through those processes. But yes, membership, as long as it remains democratic, members can join and exchange, and stewardship agreements can probably be assigned. We haven't done it yet. Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Rowan, additionally?
Too late at night for me to kind of work through that one. Sorry.
Well, I've been thinking about it as I've been making salad.
I think when the average age of farmers is 68, it's not a bad question to actually ask. Like, in a 25-year contract, there's a reasonable chance that a succession issue is going to happen within our membership at some stage. So
I have a question. I know we keep saying farmers, but I do get the impression that you don't have to be a conventional farmer, that you could be somebody who owns, 40 up to, a few hundred acres of land, and you're just looking after it and improving it.
yeah, so the again, out of the principles co-design part, we decided that it shouldn't be a farmer, it should be an active land manager. And that would enable us to get lifestylers and Indigenous people who might not have actual title to their property, but are active land managing. So there's good reasons for that definition. Yeah.
So then something like a land corporation that is perhaps doing cultural burning, and looking after other people's properties, they could be a potential.
Conceivably, it will depend again contextually on markets as to what they can and can't specifically do. But for us, if they're an active land manager looking after a defined mappable digital twin that can go into a stewardship agreement, have tenure over the contract period,
I have to confess, I'm possibly the only one here that doesn't quite get this, and I'll maybe talk to Pamela about it later. The concept of the digital twin, I'm still trying to get my head around, but I'm assuming that means I'm starting here, but I'm going to here.
Like a digital twin, trying to explain with you remember, we all had farms, but now we've also got websites with our farms URL Blue Dog Farms, right? That's a digital representation.
Okay, I've got it.
It can do e-commerce, yeah. The digital twin is like a juiced up version of your website. It can also interact with your customers and do digital commerce. But now you can model the landscape. So you can say, what happens if I change the agronomy here, planted some trees here, did this activity here? You can then enter into agreements. You can do more sophisticated things. But underpinning a website is a few words. Underpinning a digital twin is soil data, vegetation data, a questionnaire results that you've filled in. Maps, and so it's far more robust as a digital asset of your farm. Yeah,
Audie, that was such an elegant and eloquent answer. Thank you. I was going to try to explain it to you and Linda, and it wasn't going to be anything like that. I have a question here from Pam. Are there any written case studies? Also, she's curious about current status of the below subject, which is the Australian Carbon Credit Union's unit's income, classified as primary income or not. So her question, Pam, I wish you'd ask this. Is the income from the sale of the ACCUs considered to be assessable primary production income of the business that you conduct? And the answer is no.
So
Pam, what?
I just cut and paste that from the ATO's website, but I know when I was doing the stakeholder engagement for the Land Restoration Fund in our setup period, this was a really critical question coming forward from a lot of landholders, that the income from ERF contracts wasn't necessarily classified as farming income. So there were issues around that. And while we're on the topic of finance, I also popped a question in there. Sorry, guys, but I just have experience of these coming forward from landholders. A question in there about eligible interest holder consent from banks where there's mortgages over the lands, and how your mutual is dealing with that, because we had experience of banks, which I won't name, not giving their consent for contracts to be signed with the ERF because of those permanence periods and their view about what a carbon contract did to the value of their asset as they saw it.
And was that how long ago, Pam?
2 years ago.
2?
Yeah.
Has finance director written all over it, Rowan?
That we've as Bordy said, we haven't entered into any transactions as yet. So like we can't say we've had direct experience. We have had many conversations with many banks, and that has come up as an issue. It's come up as an issue that they're wanting to resolve. So like talking to, for example, the head of natural capital at NAB, he talks about the difficulty that the NAB's been having in working through. So I'm using it, but like, okay, it's a direct example, but like, so the difficulty that they're having in working through exactly that concept of understanding, are these contracts actually, and the management actions that go with them, are they actually diminishing the value of the land, or are they actually assisting in creating additional value for the land? They're having, so we're actually trying to work with them currently to try and go, right, we think the environmental farm assessment, the data has been collected through that process, can be used to help banks better understand the environmental value, the value of the environmental assets on farm. Currently, CBA, in fact, they've all got sustainability linked loans in place, but the sustainability linked loans are for very large farms, basically. So they don't offer them, they don't have the ability to offer them for smaller farms. So I think what I'm trying to say here, Pamela, is that I don't know that they're still stuck at where the issue that you're talking to, although it has come up. But I do know that they're struggling with this concept in total, still struggling with this concept in total. And at the end of the day, it'll be data that unlocks it.
Yeah, and I think, because I have done a little bit of work in this space, I think you'll find too that the banks that are headquartered in Europe, which have compliance regimes that are a little bit ahead of ours in terms of the climate stuff and the carbon stuff, view this through a bit of a different prism than what your NABs and your CBAs, etc. do. So, I mean, that at least is my experience, and that's more recent than 2 years. So, yeah, I just think it's a really interesting question and shows that this conversation needs to be pushing forward on a lot of levels. And, kudos to you guys for jumping in here, I'd say.
Well, again, I think it's just one of the foundational principles of the mutuals. If we can, create a stronger hand through coming together, and the ability to negotiate and open, like banks, so I worked for a bank. I started out in banking, so I understand we're dim. Bankers are dim. Like you just have a very limited ability to kind of look outside. You know that saying about a bank will lend you an umbrella until it starts raining. That's it's just so. So the idea of a mutual enabling farmers to come together to create an institution that can increase negotiating power and to enable that conversation about the data without actually even enabling farmers to necessarily share the data. You don't necessarily need to share it in order to be able to generate the kind of the insights the banks need in order to be able to kind of move from where they are. Yeah, so.
Thank you, Rowan, and thank you, Pam. Karen, you have your hand up.
Yes, while we were sort of talking a little bit about the environmental assessments there and a little bit more about the nuts and bolts, creating the digital twin, those sort of initial steps, did I miss writing down that there was assistance? Like I thought I missed writing down a term that was used to explain how that initial assessment is done, or is that process set up in a way that farmers can self-assess? They can do that step-by-step process themselves.
Yeah, I think Wardy, this will be a good one for you to answer, but yeah, you're talking about the initial farm assessment that's done.
I think the best way to describe it is it's self-assessment to a point. So there's like 185 questions that take about 4 hours to fill in, that go through literally a whole of farm kind of questionnaire. Then there is mapping, where we look at the vegetation and the soil zones and the production zones, and we determine sampling sites. Then going out into the field, we do the accounting for nature level 3 biodiversity and soils measurements, and at the same time do some water use efficiency, and if there's food production in season, we'll do some chemical residue and nutrient density tests. That then provides the base data for the birth of your digital twin, and gives you enough information to then inform lenders, to then inform environmental markets, whether they're regulated or voluntary, or conservation markets, which tend to be state-based, or federal, international. It doesn't really matter. Once you've got that base of data, you can get indicative ideas about your best opportunity, and you can start to model things. Hopefully that answers it, Karen.
Yeah, no, that's pretty good. And with that initial step, are the farmers required to pay fees for the mapping and the water and the soil testing, that sort of thing? That would all be up front, and then there is that ongoing 10% to the fund later.
Yeah, and those fees for the first 1,000 farmers, we're looking at $1,000 per farm.
Yeah.
So they're not, yet to be seen, but there might be $40,000 or $400,000 worth of environmental assets on your farm. But until you kind of have an environmental farm assessment, you can't actually quantify that. You can't get to then change practices that help you tap into that. And it's a bit weird that we know everything of value on our farm, from the chemicals and the fertilizers and the inputs, except our environmental assets, upon which all of the rest of it hangs.
Yeah.
So if that was any other business except for farming, and you were so contingent on that asset base and you hadn't understood it, you would think that business person crazy. But in farming, we don't actually understand our environmental assets. I think that's crazy.
Yeah, it's just crazy. Now, we're running 8 minutes over time. Shall we say goodnight?
Unless there's any other burning questions.
Yeah. It's been great to have so many good questions. Go for it.
It has. Go for it, Karen. If you've got one more, go for it.
What's next?
Wow.
What's next?
Good question.
Yes, great question. So opportunity to join the waitlist, Karen, for your farm assessment. We'd really encourage people to join that waitlist.
Yep.
And in 2 weeks' time, we're actually going to host webinar series 2, which is all about accessing environmental markets. So we encourage, we'll be sending out information to that in the coming days, surrounding how you can join in. Very similar process to this one, joining in tonight. So, so that is the path forward.